Well, if you've seen the film The Longest Yard, then you've seen the vehicle that we're going to talk about next, and that is the awesome, quirky, funky Citroen SM. Now, I realize that this subject matter is a bit different than what we're typically used to on this channel, but I have to confess that I have a love for French automobiles specifically because they're usually quirky, kind of funky looking, often have funky controls and drivability. They look, I think, unique, and they ride great. One of the things, if you have driven a French car, whether it's a Citroen or a Peugeot, the overall ride of the car is generally exemplary. Now, maybe not so much true today, but back in the 1960s, as an example, if you drove a Citroen DS, great driving car. Same with the SM. Or the Peugeot, you can pick your Peugeot from the time frame. So let's start talking about this Citroën because it is an awesome, awesome car and has so many pioneering engineering features that really aren't even on cars today all these years later. And this car was made from 1970 to 1975. Let's get started and with a little bit of the backstory. Now, during this time frame, the late 60s to early 1970s, Citroën was not doing well financially. In fact, some estimates were that the company was losing the equivalent in today's dollars, about $900 to $1,000 for every car that it was producing. And it had lost, I believe, from 1968 to 1970, a total of around $111 million in those dollars back then, which is about the equivalent of $1 billion today. So the company was having a number of financial challenges. And it really had a number of ownership stakes in other companies, including Maserati and a truck maker called Berliet. So Citroën was not just producing cars with its name, but it also had ownership over some other companies, and that relationship with Maserati is going to come into play as we discuss this car. In turn, Citroën was owned, about a quarter of it, by Michelin Tire and Rubber, 26% by Fiat, and the remaining roughly 50% by the public. When Pierre Bercot, a longtime Citroën executive, left the firm in January 1971, in fact, a Michelin individual, François Rollier, succeeded Bercot as the Citroën chairman of the board. And it's with this particular backdrop and in this environment that Citroën decided that it needed a vehicle to compete in this kind of three-door hatchback sports car marketplace. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that this class was relatively dead in France and wasn't well populated with competition from French automakers because the French government had imposed a puissance fiscale horsepower tax on automobiles ever since World War II. And this meant that the SM had to be powered by a relatively small engine at the time. And, of course, what did it get? A 2.7-liter, 90-degree V6 sourced from Maserati. Hence the relationship that I was just talking about before. This V6 was designed to be manufactured on tooling that also made Maserati's V8. So it's an unusual 90-degree V6 with double overhead cams, and there are a couple different variants, either employing 3 Weber carburetors or Bosch D-Jetronic fuel injection. There also was a later 3-liter engine that came into play in 1973. But no matter which engine that you got, the 2.7, whether it was carbureted or fuel injected, or the 3-liter, they didn't make much horsepower. They made somewhere around 168 to 178 horsepower in top form. So unfortunately, horsepower was not a strong suit of what was really supposed to be a sporty car. But as I mentioned, the engine was able to be manufactured on Maserati's existing V8 tooling, and as a consequence, other Maseratis actually ended up using this V6. Most prominently, the Maserati Biturbo in the 1980s had this. Of course, it was turbocharged by that point. And the beautiful Maserati Merak from 1972 to 1982 also had this particular engine. So we've got a French car with an Italian engine. Sounds like a great recipe for reliability. Oh, but wait, there's more. Because the Citroen SM had so many technological innovations associated with it that it's somewhat hard to keep one of these on the road just from an overall reliability standpoint. But I have to say that when everything is working well, they are just an amazing vehicle and a beacon of technology, even again by today's standards. Let's talk a little bit about some of those interesting features. The first is the suspension setup that was employed on the SM, and that was a hydrodynamic self-leveling suspension. And if you look under the hood here, you'll see these green spheres everywhere. Well, what are those? That is effectively the spring and the damper associated with the wheel. That's what it looks like. There is no spring on these cars. There is no shock. It's all contained in these little spheres that have a gas chamber as well as a chamber for hydraulic oil. And as the wheel goes up and down, there's the oil separated by a diaphragm, which separates the oil from the gas inside the sphere. It has this wonderful way of really dampening the overall road shocks and vibrations and contributing to an awesome ride on the car. Now, this suspension setup wasn't novel just on the SM. In fact, the Citroen DS that came before it had a similar setup, and the SM was based on that DS. So not only did it have this hydrodynamic suspension, but it was also front-wheel drive. So this is a front-wheel drive sports car, longitudinally mounted engine, but again, front-wheel drive. So crazy for the time. Again, front-wheel drive was super novel in many cases, at least in the United States. And, well, you can imagine that one of the fears of engineers who were designing a sports car like this was, how do you handle the torque steer from an engine with this front-wheel drive setup? Well, thankfully, the 2.7 or 3-liter V6 didn't have all that much torque, so that was somewhat of an easy feat compared to, as an example, a Cadillac Eldorado with an 8.2-liter V8 that was front-wheel drive. But one of the things that they did as a consequence was that the steering in these SMs is super light, and it's also very fast. It's just 2 turns lock to lock. So by comparison, if you were driving a Ford of the era with power steering, it would have about 5 turns lock to lock, and a GM car maybe 4.5-ish turns lock to lock. So 2 turns lock to lock. Basically, full lock is 1 revolution away, either way that you turn the wheel. So they drive like a go-kart, and it really takes getting used to driving these cars because they have no steering feel, and they are super fast when it comes to inputs and relatively twitchy. The other strange thing about these vehicles is not only is the steering switchy, but take a look at this photo here of the clutch, the brake, and the accelerator pedal. Now, this is not the average setup that you would see in an American car. You've got the accelerator pedal that's hinged at the bottom, the clutch that's hinged at the top, and then look at the brake pedal. It has no pedal travel, apparently. What's going on there? Well, it's affectionately known as this mushroom, or the button that you push on it. That is the brake pedal. And the braking force is proportional to how hard you are depressing that little button. So the first thing that people often do when they drive an SM or another Citroen of the period with this button brake pedal is they basically put their face through the windshield when they stop for the first time, because it is very sensitive. It takes getting used to, but once you get used to it and you've driven an SM, the brake becomes more natural. The pedal feel, I shouldn't even say pedal feel, the button feel. The steering becomes more natural, and the 5-speed gearbox on these is also, I would say, on par, maybe even better than Honda's in some cases. And for anybody who's driven a Honda 5-speed manual transmission, say from the 80s as an example, you'll know what I mean. It's one finger in and out of each gear. Of course, the 5-speed, the gear selector is also relatively interesting in a piece of artwork. It's basically this barrel that rotates as you shift it back and forth. I've never seen that in another car before or since. But the overall strange innovations don't just stop there. So remember, I've already talked about this strange brake pedal, the hydrodynamic suspension, which, by the way, allowed you to adjust the height of the vehicle. You could raise it, you could lower it. There was a little lever that you could use inside the car to execute that change. And that suspension, by the way, was so innovative and so well received and did its job so well that other automakers bought it, including some English fine cars like Bentley actually employed it on their vehicles for a number of years. It was that good. They didn't think that they could come up with anything better. But the innovations continue. And one of the other interesting innovations was disc brakes at all four corners. One would say, well, that's not all that interesting. But remember, this is 1970 to 1975. That is pretty sweet. But the front brakes were inboard. They're not out on the wheels. They're actually inboard of the overall suspension setup. And again, super cool. You would see that on some other vehicles like Jaguars or Jaguars if you're in the US. So it was relatively rare, but it was used on other vehicles as well. And those brakes were cooled with large cooling ducts that were on the underside of the car. So Citroen was thinking about brake cooling at this point. And there also were some other things, like the wipers. They had a low speed setting, and the low speed was really rain sensitive. Now, rain sensitive wipers in this time frame, how was that executed? Well, there was actually a sensor that would sense how much current it took the wiper motor to move the wipers across the glass, and you can imagine that it takes more current if the glass is dry than if it's wet. And as a result, it would adjust the wiper speed to that particular current that was being drawn. Pretty sweet. I don't know of any other car that employed a similar setup. If you were lucky enough to get a European car, you had a headlight that actually turned with the steering wheel so that it could better help you see around corners. This was something that Citroen also had on the DS. And again, didn't make it to the United States because for whatever reason, despite the Tucker, I guess this piece of legislation wasn't in place back at that point, you could not have headlamps that moved with the wheels or otherwise on U.S. vehicles. And so only the European cars got that, and the headlamps, the inner one there, would turn as you went around the corner, again, to help you see around it. Let's return under hood for a second and take a look at one of these Maserati V6s running. And here it is, and you can see these are the 3 Weber 2-barrel carburetors. But also take a look at this little eccentric shaft there that's spinning out of the front part of the motor. Notice it's over top of the rack and pinion steering, but that eccentric would then drive the accessories on the engine. So you can see in this photo, there's the air conditioning, the alternator, as well as the pump for the hydraulic fluid that are all driven off of that eccentric that's spinning off of the engine. So kind of a strange setup, but that's how they executed that on this particular vehicle. Now, as we turn inside, you'll also see that the SM is just a wonderful place to sit with very comfortable bucket seats. And you have the typical Citroen one-spoke steering wheel, although it's a little bit more sporty here than it was in the DS with the rather thin spoke. A full suite of gauges also came with every SM. You can see the shifter there that I was talking about in the middle of the center console, as well as the emergency brake lever. And to the right of the emergency brake is actually the radio. So the radio is on the center console and not on the dash. Notice also the dashes form this kind of graceful sweeping arc that is now often imitated, but I believe this was the first or one of the first cars to have this kind of an interior dash theme, and again, very attractive. Here's a look from the passenger side facing the driver's side, and you'll see the climate control there on the instrument panel. And I love how the instrument panel flows into the center console just gracefully. It's done beautifully on this vehicle. Somehow the structure must be relatively stiff so that there's not this itching back and forth of the dash to that center console. And the door panel, I think, is also a thing of beauty. Notice how the handle is well integrated. That slope of the handle is the same as the slope of the armrest. I just think that that's a great touch from a design standpoint. You also got these cool gauges, kind of oval shaped, done by Jaeger. And I, again, don't typically see oval shaped gauges. I do enjoy that you have the leftmost one there is the air vent pod. So, oh well, kind of cool. Little quirks on your French car. The steering column, by the way, would adjust not only up and down like a typical tilt wheel, but also you could adjust it in and out. Another novel element for the time. So there we have it, a super cool, quirky French sporty car, a French vehicle powered by a Maserati engine. That's a 3-door hatchback, and an overall, I guess, amazingly cool looking design. I don't know how else to describe it. No other car like this. I love the barrel section to the side here that you can really see. And the hatch is, again, just a neat shape. The full kind of wall-to-wall tail lamp treatment there with the license plate above the tail lights set into the hatchback. I just think it's an overall neat look. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.